Hello, everyone. I'm Sammy Morris, and I'm professor and head of archives and special collections at Purdue University. I want to welcome you to this video class on caring for personal and family collections. It's one of my very favorite things to talk about, and I'm hoping to hear more from all of you about the collections that you have or things that you're interested in preserving from your family or personal collections. So I'd like to start off by just a few housekeeping things. We will have time for question and answer at the end. So during the presentation, if you would please keep your microphone muted and your video turned off, it'll help with our decreasing background noise and keep us having a good internet connection going. So the first thing I would like to do is take a poll of you all, the audience, to see what kinds of collections you have or what kinds of materials you're interested in saving. So let's take a few seconds here to have you indicate on the poll which of the things are in your collections, and that will let us know what kinds of things we should cover today. Looks like we've got lots of photographs, personal letters, and computer media. Good. Three-dimensional artifacts. Great. I think we'll go ahead and stop the poll here. It looks like the majority of you are interested in photographs and negatives, but we also have quite a few interested in documents and other materials as well. So we'll go ahead and move forward. Let's see here. Apologies, I'm still figuring out how to move my screen forward. Okay, so the learning objectives for this course will be those of you who are in attendance will be able to differentiate between preservation and conservation. And that's really important because the things I talk about today will be specific to preservation, and they're things that you can do at home. Conservation is really a separate field where specialized professionals with degrees in chemistry and a lot of experience know how to restore materials. So we aren't going to get into conservation work really today, although we will touch on the differences between that and preservation. I'd also hope that you will gain familiarity with best practices for storing your collections, and you'll be able to conceptualize the kind of work that archivists do when we process collections that come into the archives, and hopefully apply those same methods to your own collection. We'll gain familiarity with basic preservation methods, and I'll also leave you with some resources on identifying archival suppliers and additional preservation resources that you can explore after the class today. So personal and family collections, what do we mean by this? When I think of personal and family collections, I think of collections that are unique and they were created or collected by you or your family. So these are collections that have special meaning to you, and they might represent your identity, culture, family history, or they might better identify your collecting interests to others. So these might be things that you started collecting long ago and they don't relate to your family, and that's fine. So we'll be looking at a little bit of all of those kinds of collections today. These are materials that have high value, and that doesn't necessarily mean monetary value. For my purposes as an archivist, the values that we're really interested in are historical value, research value, and intrinsic value. But for your purposes, these will likely have high value, sentimental value, value as memory of your family and its culture and history. And finally, these are things that are worthy of long-term or permanent preservation. And that's really the definition of archives themselves. They're collections that are created, intended to be preserved for long-term so that they can continue to be enjoyed or made accessible. So, what are some examples of personal collections? I have some examples here. Things that you might find in your own personal and family materials would be letters, correspondence, whether that's paper or now increasingly in email. Home movies and videos. So, these might include things like VHS tapes or 35 millimeter film or different film gauges. Diaries and memoirs, scrapbooks, baby books, photographs, wedding albums. Increasingly, our photographs are digital, so I'll talk a little bit about that today. Although, in the course of an hour, there's not really time to delve deeply into that, so I'm going to leave you with some resources you can further explore. And we'll also talk about preserving books, manuscripts, and to some degree, family artifacts. So, in thinking about the difference between preservation and conservation, it's important to keep in mind that preservation are protective steps, preventive steps that you can take or that anyone can take with some knowledge of how best to store and preserve collections. So, the steps we take for preservation are things that we take to prevent their loss or decay or destruction. And the thing to keep in mind about most collections is that they are aging naturally, and they are regularly going to show signs of decay and deterioration over time. So the goal of preservation is to prevent that or to slow down the natural degradation of the materials by taking certain steps that we'll talk about a little bit more. Another important distinction between preservation and conservation is that preservation is usually looking at steps you take to protect and preserve the collection as a whole, whereas conservation treatment, which is done by professional conservators, is usually restoring, repairing, or in some way treating an individual item one at a time. Um, some of the examples of preservation, which is preventative and protective, are thinking about the ways that you store your collections. And this is one of the things that I want to most heavily emphasize today, that the best thing you can do to preserve your collection is to think about its storage environment. So there are a lot of different ways to protect and preserve collections, but in the long run, the least expensive and the most efficient is making sure that you're storing your collections in a place that's right, has the right environmental conditions to make sure they last as long as possible. So some examples of preservation are controlling the temperature and humidity in the storage area where you keep your collections, making sure that you're doing anything to cut down on light exposure, and also thinking about things that could occur like fire or floods or theft, and having some plan in place for how to deal with those issues. If you're able to, you might think about security systems for your collections. These are all things we do to prevent later deterioration or degradation. Now, when we talk about conservation, we're talking about professional treatment, repair, or restoration that's done by a trained conservator. And this would be looking at a torn photograph or document or a book that's coming out of its binding, any action that you would take to try to repair an individual item. So it requires really highly specialized professional knowledge and skills. Most professional conservators have degrees in chemistry or extensive coursework in chemistry so that they understand how the actions they take with the collections will impact them over time. So some examples of conservation treatment are mending a torn document, uh, mending a photograph, or a damaged book. And so, again, this differentiates from preservation because it is individual item level treatment. So I'm going to emphasize quite a bit today the importance of how you store your collections, because this is, again, one of the things that you can easily control, and it doesn't require a lot of funding to do this. You want to store your collections in a place that's cool and dry. And when I say cool and dry, I mean a temperature in the range of 65 to 70 degrees and a relative humidity in the range of 30% to 50%. There are tools that you can buy at many hardware stores or just general stores that can record maximum and minimum temperature and humidity in your home. They're not too expensive, and it's a good way to get a handle on which which places in your home might be best to store the collection. Or if you're thinking about storing it offsite, being able to monitor those conditions. So we want to store things in a place that's cool and dry, and ideally store things in archival containers. And this would mean acid-free, lignin-free boxes, folders, and other types of supplies that you would use to protect your collections from light exposure, dust, leaks, and that kind of thing. You want to also think about how you're preventing light damage to your collection. So, one of the most harmful things to collections is natural light or sunlight. So, you don't want to store your collections near sources of light like windows or skylights. You also want to think about the kind of lighting you have in your home or wherever you're storing your collection, because things like fluorescent lights put out UV too. So you want to always think about what steps are you taking to prevent the light exposure, and knowing that light exposure is cumulative and irreversible, it's something to take very seriously. And this is something that I see a lot when people want to exhibit their or display their collections. It's very important to think about the long-term damage that that light exposure can have to your collections. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the ways that you can prevent that from happening. Containers, like archival folders and boxes, also protect your materials from dust, and they protect the materials from rapid fluctuations in temperature and humidity. So you want to store these materials away from any sources of light, heat, or moisture. So don't store them in places like your laundry room or your restroom or anywhere that there are sinks, pipes, or heaters close by. Another thing that causes frequent damage that we don't think about a lot is the amount of handling that these collections receive, especially if they are already fragile or partially damaged. So one way to think about minimizing handling is think about whenever you're sorting your materials, trying to go ahead and assign locations to them. And I'll talk a little bit later, so that when you are looking for things in your collection, you're not having to handle the whole collection every time. This will enable you to go quickly to the things that you want to pull out, and you'll want to think about how you're supporting those items when you do that. So with a book, for example, the spine is very vulnerable. So you don't ever want to flatten a book totally open or turn it upside down and flatten it. You want to always think about how are you supporting those end boards and how are you supporting the spine. So this is why when you go into archives and libraries, you often see book cradles or book supports for rare books, because this really cuts down on the stress we put on those items when we turn the pages and read them. Another thing to think about is your photographic collections are really, really susceptible to light damage, and that's because photographic processes for print photography and earlier photographic formats, going back to the beginning of photography, these are light-sensitive materials, so they use light to expose the collections and to expose the photographs. And if you keep applying light to those, they're going to fade over time. So that photographs and negatives in particular are really important not to keep on permanent display unless you have them in UV filtered glass or some sort of system protecting them from that ongoing light exposure. Some of the other best practices for storing your collections are making sure that they're not stored on the ground. Often we will have leaks or floods in our homes or even spills, and having the collection at least 4 inches off the ground can protect it from that kind of damage. One of the biggest enemies to collections is mold, and that's because mold can be extremely toxic to people, and it also can spread and contaminate your entire collection if it forms on one piece or a few pieces. So in order to prevent mold, you again want to store things in a cool, dry space, but you also want to have good air circulation. And think about the filtering system that you have on your HVAC system, making sure that you have good air filters that are filtering out pollutants or things that can settle on your collection and cause damage. Good airflow is really important for preventing mold, because mold likes to grow in warm, moist conditions where there's stagnant air. So making sure that you have air moving in the place where you have your collections will help extend their life. And a few additional things, if these are feasible and affordable for you, you might consider some sort of fire detection or prevention system. Fire is definitely a risk with paper-based and other cultural heritage materials. So if you're able to at least have smoke detectors or something near the collection that could alert you if there is a fire. And then you might consider keeping really valuable family documents and photos in a safety deposit box, or even better, keeping the originals in a safety deposit box and having backup copies or scans that you can refer to in your home. Now, if you really enjoy looking at your collection regularly, this may not be feasible, but for things like baby books or wedding albums or early family photos where you know that you're going to have other people probably in your life who have an interest in those, it can be helpful to store them in a safe place offsite in case anything happens to your home. And if you are collecting valuable materials, and I say that with the caveat that, for most of us, our family collections are not going to have high monetary value, but they do, again, have very high historical significance and personal significance to us. However, if you collect art or rare books or autographs or anything that has a monetary value, you want to also think about the risks of theft to your collection or the risks of loss to your collection in case of disaster. And so it would be in your best interest to have those kinds of high monetary value collections insured against loss or theft. I just want to reiterate what I've already said multiple times, and that you'll get tired of hearing me saying it, but the best, most effective way to preserve your collection is storing it in a space that's cool and dry, where it's protected from light, theft, and dust. So looking at NISO standards, these are the national standards for how to store paper collections. I mentioned this earlier, but temperature and humidity are critical. So you'll see that NISO recommends for libraries and archives that our stacks not go above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's because when you start to go above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, you have more risk of mold, but you also are accelerating the natural chemical reactions in your collection. So almost all of us have collections that have inherent vice, which means that they are comprised of materials that are naturally deteriorating, and they might represent an accumulation of different materials that are causing damage to each other. One example would be a photograph that has multiple layers. So it has a paper support, but then it also has emulsion and silver. And so you have all of these different chemicals in one piece of a photograph. And whenever we have heat and humidity, all of the natural degradation in those chemicals and materials starts to ramp up and accelerate. So keeping your temperature down below 70 degrees if possible will really extend the life of your collection, as will keeping it in a dry space that is no higher than 50% relative humidity. Ideally, if you were able to store these, say, in an offsite location where you could control the temperature and humidity, you might go even lower to 65 degrees or 60 degrees and down to 30% humidity if possible. It can be difficult to maintain those ranges in your home. So what I would suggest is that you just find a place in your home that's very comfortable for you, that's cool and dry, and you consider that as a location for your collection. So one thing that we're often asked is what is the work that archivists do when a collection comes into the archives? How do we put the collection in order? How do we preserve it? And how do we provide access to it? One of the things that's very critical about working with collections, especially collections that are unpublished, so you don't have a lot of information about them. This might be, family letters where there's things that it's not clear when they were written, or it might be photographs that don't have people identified in them. You'll want to take some time to think about how to identify these kinds of things in your collection. And that might involve talking to friends and family members who can help you identify people and images and things like that. Um, you want to put together as much information you have about where did your collection come from, who created it, who owned it before you, when did it come to you, and why was this collection created? So if it's a family collection, you might have inherited it from other members of your family. So documenting where you received the collection from and when is important. If it's a collection that you've purchased, you might save your receipts and documentation of those purchases as good background information for anyone who would come upon the collection later. So thinking about the context is something really important to us in archives. You also want to think about if you are ever planning to donate or sell your collection, you want to think about who is the legal owner. So often, possession implies ownership, but that's not always the case, especially with family collections where things are passed down through generations and there might be members of the family who all have an interest in those materials. So it's helpful to talk to your family and anyone else who's a stakeholder in this collection and make sure that you have a good understanding of who owns it. And then you also want to understand who owns the rights to it. Something that's very complicated with unpublished papers, for example, is that you can have multiple rights holders in an archival collection or a collection of personal papers. So just as an example, if you write a letter to someone, you are the creator of that letter and you own the copyright. But if someone writes a letter to you, they have the copyright to that letter, even though it might be in your physical possession. So the reason I bring this up is for archivists, this awareness of this information is critical to whether we can share access to the collection, especially whether we can digitize it or let patrons make copies. So it's helpful for you to have an understanding of that as well, especially if you plan to scan your collections and put them online in some way or to publish from them. Um, so when we're talking about the sort of the first things we do in archival processing is the first thing we do is pull all the collection together and know where it's located. And that's something that I think is just as necessary for you to think about all the places in your home or storage areas, your garages, basements, attics, closets, where these collections might be, and to start to bring them together and put them in the place that they would get the best environment. So you're going to want to start taking notes on what's in your collection, where it's currently stored, and any things you see that are concerning in regard to the condition of the collection, like evidence of mold or evidence of pests. So your initial survey of your collection will just involve bringing it all together and taking notes about it. So things you'll want to take notes about are the size of different materials. So if this is an archival paper collection, for example, most of the papers might fall in the range of 8.5 by 11 inches, or so they could fit in letter size file folders and boxes. But if you have things that are oversized, you'll need to take note of that for whenever you order archival supplies for those materials. You also want to take just some general notes about the overall collection, like what are the date ranges there? Who are the different people represented in the collection and what subjects do they cover? Is it mostly a family collection? Is it a collection of your business or your professional organization? So thinking about those kinds of subjects, because when we come to the stage of organizing and arranging the collection, that will be important. And then again, regarding condition, if you see things that are in poor condition, you really want to segregate those from the rest of the collection so they don't contaminate your whole collection. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And finally, in regards to privacy, we often don't think about this with our own personal collections, but it becomes an issue when you share access to your collections. So there might be letters or diaries or other documents or materials in your collection that represent the private interests or confidential aspects of other people. So examples of that would be documents with social security numbers or driver's license numbers, documents that have information about people's health or medical conditions, anything that includes student work or student grades. These are the kinds of things you would want to look out for if you were donating or selling your collection, so that you made sure to talk with whoever was going to be the recipient of the collection about your wishes, perhaps to restrict access for a period of time. So when we start processing archival collections, we create a processing plan for each collection that we process. And in that plan, we decide how we're going to arrange or organize the materials. And part of that, a huge part of that actually, is thinking about establishing series or groups within your collection. So if you have a collection of photographs, for example, you might make series based on which family members are in the photographs. So that you would group all the photographs of your uncle in this folder and all the photographs of your cousin in another. Or you might think about arranging those chronologically so that they're filed by date and you can find them that way. Another way would be by major event in your life or family gatherings. So these series are up to you, but you want them to bring together like materials that belong together and provide context to each other. So another thing that we would be doing in thinking about our processing plan is identifying what steps we're going to take to preserve items in the collection. And usually at a minimum, we will put collections into acid-free, lignin-free boxes and folders. But there sometimes are additional things that need more help, like torn items can be placed into plastic sleeves, and I'll talk about that a little later. You want to get a sense of what are all the supplies you're going to need to process this collection. So again, looking at sizes, looking at the overall size of the collection and how many containers you would need. And it's important to, whenever you purchase supplies for your collection, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, you want to look for acid-free and lignin-free. Many things start out as acid-free, but over time they become acidic. But lignin-free means that there's much less likelihood of the paper deteriorating at the same rate that it would if it had lignin in it. So when you place acidic items into a lignin-free folder, it can really slow down the natural deterioration of those items. Another thing we think about when we're creating our processing plan is, what is the source of this information? And there are two very important archival principles that guide all archives work with paper materials and unpublished materials. And those are provenance and original order. And any archivist will tell you that everything that they do with a collection is guided by these principles. The principle of provenance refers to the origin or the source of the material. So who created it or who collected it? Where did it come from? Who has owned it and passed it along? And you don't want to intermingle things that are created by different people. So as an example, you might have inherited family photos or documents from both sides of your family, and those to you represent your family. But to someone who came to the collection later, they may not know who people are. And so grouping things according to the person or branch of your family that created it will help people distinguish between things where it might not be clear who made them, or it will help them more easily determine where to go in the collection to find particular things. So the rule of provenance says that you never mix collections by different creators. And what that means is that if you had a collecting interest in Civil War memorabilia, and you purchased, let's say, a Civil War uniform from a particular soldier, and then you purchased a diary from a different soldier, knowing who created those, who owned them, is very important context for anyone who might want to study them later for scholarship or just for, general awareness. And so you wouldn't mix those things together unless you were very carefully keeping count of where each item came from, because that becomes very important if someone wants to cite the material or refer back to it, that you know who created it and the context of that item. So provenance says we keep each collection by each creator separate. In a family, of course, you might have multiple creators, but you could separate those within that collection by series. So each person in your family might be one series within a larger family collection. And then original order also drives our arrangement work. And what that means is that if a collection comes to you and the person who owned or created it before had it in any sort of discernible order, then you want to maintain that order because it gives you information about how the previous owners or creators used the collection themselves, which is again important context for research. So if you received a collection of documents and your grandfather's letters and they were already in chronological order, you wouldn't want to change that order because it shows that that's how he filed his documents himself and referred to them. But what often happens with family collections and archives is we receive things kind of in a jumble that may have no order at all. And if that's the case, then there's no clear original order, and it's up to you to come up with the order that makes the most sense for you in terms of how you would use the collection or how you anticipate other people using it. So some specific archival preservation steps we take with collections are, I mentioned earlier, we place them in acid-free, lignin-free folders and boxes. We always label folders and boxes with pencil because we don't want stray ink marks or the adhesives from labels causing damage over time. We also are looking to remove things in the collection that could be causing harm to it. So paper clips and staples rust, binder clips rust, so you want to carefully remove those from your collection. Also, sticky notes that might be a temporary note on the back or front of a photo or document will over time adhere to the document and be very difficult to remove. So in the archives, we sometimes will use sticky notes on the outside of boxes before they get a permanent label, but we would never apply a sticky note to an original archival document, photo, or rare book because it can do harm over time, especially if it's not removed quickly enough. We also look for things in the collections that are acidic, and newspapers and newspaper clippings are one of the biggest enemies to other papers in the collection. So we identify where newspapers and clippings are, and we either do preservation photocopying of those, or we might sleeve them separately from the rest of the collection just so they aren't doing harm to the other items that they are up against. You also want to be on the lookout for audiovisual and computer media. And the reason for that is the natural life of audiovisual and computer media is much shorter than it is for paper and photographs. And so the things that could be most at risk to being lost in your collection first would be things like VHS videotapes, audio cassette tapes, sound recordings and films, and also things like floppy disks, CDs, DVDs, USB drives, and things of that nature. All of those materials are things that quickly can become obsolescent in terms of how they're played and accessed. So if you're able to afford to do so, it's a good idea to start by having a company or yourself digitize those audiovisual and computer things in your collection. Now with computer media, one of the most important things is getting the information off of that media and into an environment where it can be regularly maintained, backed up, and preserved. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. You also want to think about polyester or plastic sleeves for your photos, negatives, and torn documents so that when you handle them frequently, they won't incur any additional damage. And finally, if there are oversized materials in your collection, like panoramic photographs or maps or other oversized documents, the best way to store those is to flatten them and store them flat, because having paper or other materials folded over time can create permanent tears in the folds. And also, rolling items is not ideal, but if you aren't able to store an item flat because it's so large, you can gently roll it around an acid-free core or tube and wrap it in archival tissue to store it that way. So some of the other things going through an archivist's mind when we process a collection are we're looking for anything that might need conservation treatment, and we would probably make a note of where those items are, or we would separate them out until they could receive that treatment. Again, you don't want to try to repair anything yourself. You know, there have been a lot of good intentions with people who have tried to repair documents and photos with tape or glue or things of that nature, and lamination. It's really heartbreaking when you see that happen because the intent is good, but those tapes and glues and any kinds of adhesives like that can cause a lot of damage to your collection over time. So it's hard to accept this, but if you can't afford conservation treatment and something is very damaged, the best thing you can do is stabilize it in a folder or box, or wrap it in tissue, store it in a good storage environment, and let it sit there until it can afford professional care. You never want to try to attempt that on your own. And that includes cleaning items. There are gentle ways that you can use soft erasers to clean surface dust off of documents and photos, but I wouldn't even personally attempt that unless you were shown how to do it, because you can cause tears in fragile documents by using an eraser, and it really needs to be done gently. So another thing we're looking at when we process collections is what things are lacking information. What are things that we need to do a little bit of research on? So one thing we always do when we create guides to our collections is we research the creator of the collection or the organization that created the collection, and we write a brief biographical note or historical sketch about that creator to help provide context. You may not need to do that because you're familiar with the people who created the collection, but it's helpful information for us to gather because it helps researchers. Once you've done this, once you've sorted your collection, arranged it, put it in the right boxes and folders, then you're going to be starting your inventory. And the inventory is a list that tells you where your collection is, and at a top level, what is contained in each container. So I have an example here where after you number your boxes and number your folders, you would want to start this inventory. So looking at this inventory at the bottom of the screen, we have box number, folder number, the title of the folder, which hopefully will already be supplied to you, but you may have to create a new title if there is no title there. And then the date range. What are the ranges within this folder of dates? And then the final notation is, where are you storing this material? And this is really vital, not only for you to be able to access your collections easily, but in the case of a disaster, to know where your most precious documents are and to be able to grab those quickly is very valuable. I also recommend that you keep a printout of your inventory within each container. Often we will keep these kinds of inventories in Microsoft Word documents or Excel spreadsheet or maybe a database. But because we often have computer failure or we switch to a new computer or new device, that inventory can easily become lost or even over time not able to be opened and read with your current software. So it's always a good idea to have a printout of the inventory with the collection if you can. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about archival supplies, and these are some of the important materials that we use to extend the life of a collection. So one thing that's very important when you're buying archival supplies is the word archival does not mean anything. Anyone can use archival on merchandise or supplies, and it doesn't have to adhere to any sort of professional standard. So rather than relying on that, you want to look for supplies that are acid-free and lignin-free. And I've shown some examples on the screen here of some acid-free, lignin-free manuscript boxes. You see how the acid-free folders stand up in the box, and there's a full tab across the top where you can write your folder number and your folder title. And then those documents, those folders would be in the box in a way that they're being supported. So if the box is not full, you can add spacers or other things to the box to support those folders so they're not slumping. But this is generally the way we would store paper documents in the archives, is upright in acid-free folders and boxes. Some other supplies that might be helpful would be a micro spatula, which is the device shown in the bottom right here. It's an easy way to slip a spatula under rusty staples and remove those. You never want to use a staple remover with archival materials or important documents because they often will tear the documents. So going very slowly by slipping the micro spatula under each back of the staple and lifting those ends and then pulling it from the other side is the safest way to do that. If you have something that's extremely fragile, it might be better not to remove the staple. You might just put that item in its own folder or sleeve so that the rust isn't getting on other things. Because again, you don't want to cause any damage when you're trying to preserve your materials. We also use pencils, as I mentioned earlier, for labeling photographs and file folders and boxes. And that's because over time, many markers and inks will either bleed through or fade. They also can stick to other items that are up against them. And frequently, when we get folders and boxes that already have labels on them, those often over a period of 10 to 15 years will dry up and fall off, leaving you without labels. So we use pencil because it lasts and it can easily be erased, so it's not going to damage the materials. You might also think about getting some nitrile or cotton gloves if you have a lot of photographs and negatives in your collection, or if you have a lot of films that you want to inspect, because those kinds of materials are really susceptible to the oil on our fingers and skin. And you want to have a barrier between your fingers and those materials. That being said, it's a big myth that cotton gloves or nitrile gloves should be used with all collections. In fact, I'm very opposed to that because we have less tactile ability when we wear gloves. And if you've ever turned the pages in a very fragile book, or the pages, onion skin pages or things in a scrapbook, you'll realize you really need that dexterity and tactile ability of your fingers to turn that page in a way that it doesn't hurt it. So I recommend no gloves for paper, but yes, gloves for photos and films. Thinking about how you might sleeve your photographs or other important documents, one of the best ways to do this is to use a plastic archival sleeve so that you can still see your treasured collections and still read and enjoy them, but you're protecting them from frequent handling. So often we will sleeve anything that has a tear or shows signs of damage, or we will sleeve photographs because we know that patrons in the reading room will be handling those, and we want to allow them to do that without having to take the items out of something else, which could also cause damage. So whenever I talk about archival plastic, it's very important to know what the plastic is made of. This is another one of those things where if you have good intentions, you could accidentally do harm. So you don't want to buy just any plastic sleeve. You need to know what the plastic is made of. And the only acceptable archival plastics are polyester, polypropylene, and polyethylene. I would be suspicious and very reluctant to use any other kind of plastic, especially if the plastic type is not identified. There is a notorious kind of plastic called PVC that has caused much irreparable harm with collections, because these kinds of plastics that aren't archival off-gas. And what happens is if you put a historic photo or document in an archival sleeve that's off-gassing, you're going to be accelerating the natural degradation of the paper, the inks, the photo emulsion, and so forth. And you never want to laminate your collections. This was something that was outdated advice in the preservation and conservation community many decades ago. And we still occasionally see people laminating, but there are multiple reasons not to do this. The most important reason is lamination over time will cause harm to the documents. And there have been very important documents in U.S. history that have been laminated, and it has taken professional conservators much work and effort to try to restore those. And often you can't reverse lamination. So once it is adhered to the document or the photo and becomes sealed, there's really not much you can do. You've kind of created a microenvironment where things are off-gassing and chemicals are mixing, and it creates big problems for your collection. So try not to ever laminate, and try to know what kind of plastic you're using that is coming in contact with your materials. Some of the other kinds of supplies you might think about are stainless steel paper clips or archival plastic clips. So I mentioned earlier removing rusty paper clips. Stainless steel paper clips will not rust, so that could be a way to replace your rusty clips as you're going through the collection, and that will enable you to keep common or linked documents and materials together. Or you can use archival plastics clips, although a word of caution, these do put a lot of pressure on the materials and they can break. So I tend to usually recommend the stainless steel paper clips, or taking a piece of acid-free paper and wrapping it without any adhesives around the grouping of documents and photos to kind of maintain keeping them together. Acid-free archival tissue is a great supply to have on hand, and especially if you have artifacts, three-dimensional objects, textiles, clothing, anything like that that needs some padding and support and protection from moving around in a box. Archival acid-free tissue is terrific for that. And you can often wrap it around bulky items and then place those into a box, and the tissue will keep the item from getting abrasion by bumping up against the sides of the box. Another handy tool that I love is cotton tying tape, and I say that with the caveat that this is not string. So one way that you can hold together a book that's falling out of its binding or hold together a scrapbook that's falling apart is using cotton tying tape, as showed in the bottom right image. Now, when you buy this, you want to get unbleached cotton that has no dyes, and you want it to have a little tiny bit of a stretch to it, because when you wrap it around the document, you don't want it to be so tight that it's pressing into the cover of your book or your document and causing harm. So this is not regular string that could cut into materials. This is a flat cotton tape that is like string, but is not going to put the same amount of pressure on your items. So, to summarize what I've gone over today, because I know that we've gone quickly and you may be feeling overwhelmed at this stage, I just want to hit on a few key reminders. First of all, know where all your collections are, and then try to bring them together into a cool, dry storage space. Never store your collections in attics, basements, or garages. You need them to be in a place that has stable temperature and humidity. Talk to your loved ones about your collection and have them help you identify the background and history of the collection or the people in the photographs and scrapbooks that you don't know. Survey your collection and order the supplies you need to start putting the collection into archival folders and boxes. And if you keep your collection on display, use UV filtering glass. If it's in a cabinet, there is UV filtering film that you can apply to glass. You also can have your items professionally mounted and framed by a professional who will use UV filtering glass if they have it on hand. So you need to ask about that if you're going to have things framed. And you also want to specify that you want all the mounting and mat board to be acid-free, lignin-free, and you don't want them using any adhesives on the item that you're putting in the frame. If adhesives must be used, ask if they can use Japanese tissue with starch paste instead of traditional adhesives. If you're feeling overwhelmed, the best way to get started is just find the part of your collection that's the most meaningful, important to you, and start there. You know, it may take a lot of time to get your collection in order, to get the right supplies and identify everything. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, it makes total sense to start small with just a portion of the collection and then grow from there. You want to be sure that you've put your collection in order and into your archival supplies before you create a detailed inventory, because otherwise your locations for those materials might change during the organization or preservation process. You also want to be sure and identify the things right now in your collection that are really highly susceptible to loss, the things that are in formats that will become obsolete or impossible for you to open and read later. So those include old polyester films, old acetate films and sound recordings, computer files, any information on CDs, DVDs, videotapes. Those are the things you want to take a really close critical eye at and determine if something is on those formats and it's important to you. You want to try to take steps to get a backup scan or copy made of those materials, because the media will not last. When it comes to digital materials, we're increasingly creating things about our lives that are no longer in paper or analog format. So, for example, you might have a personal website or blog. You might have social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You might have you definitely have email. If you're living in this time and place, you're probably dealing with email. There are things like that are really vulnerable to changes in technology. And it's a huge myth that scanning everything will preserve your collection. In fact, I don't recommend scanning your collection unless you're trying to share access to it or provide a preservation backup, because scanning your collection gives people the false sense that it's preserved, when in reality, you need to maintain those scans over time and make sure that they continue to be opened and readable. And computer files are susceptible to so many things going wrong, from a dead computer to obsolescence of the software to bit rot. There are so many things that can affect your electronic or digital collection. So those are things that you want to be sure you identify the things that are most important within those, and you're creating backups in file formats that are sustainable. So using open file formats. Recommended formats for text are PDF or PDF-A. Those are not, they are proprietary, but they have been so accepted by the US government that they are highly recommended as formats that will continue to be around. For your photographs, if you're scanning photographs or things that are not text, you want to scan as lossless TIFF images, because those are the kinds of images that will not lose information over time. And I've given you some resources at the end of this presentation to help you explore a little more what to do with your digital collections, because they are quite complex. And I just want to emphasize that your work is never done. So it's not true that scanning everything will preserve it. In fact, you're going to have to preserve those scans. So think about it as a backup or a way to share access to your collection, but not as a preservation technique. Finally, think about what's going to happen to your collection later. So you might want to think about designating a person in your family who will be the recipient of the collection, the next person to pass it along to. You could put that in your estate plans or your will, or you could determine if you want to donate your collection or sell it. Have a backup plan so that whenever you're gone, the collection will be preserved and cared for beyond your lifetime. So here are some archival supply vendors. I won't go over these in detail, but these are all trusted companies that our archives and libraries buy archival supplies from. And I highly recommend this new book that came out last year by the Society of American Archivists. It's called Creating Family Archives. And it goes into much more detail than I can today about the ways that you can preserve your family papers, your family photographs. It gives good examples of the kinds of supplies you need for photos and negatives. And it's just a great overall source, a very fast read, and good, concise information. I've also included a lot of online resources for you here, and I will not go over these individually because we're running late on time, but these will be things that you can refer back to in the video recording later that will be made available. So now I'd like to stop my part of the presentation and open this up for discussion. I'd love to hear your questions or any information that you would like to share about your collection. Do we have anyone, if you would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute your microphone and turn your video on, or you can type a question into the chat. It looks like we have one question so far. It says, I purchased that book and it is excellent. How to preserve an Army hat. Oh, great question. So with clothing and things that are, I guess I should ask, is the Army hat, what is the Army hat made of? If it's fabric or textile or something that's made of fabric-like material, what I would suggest is that you do some very gentle dusting with a very soft brush to dust off any dust or debris on the hat. And then I would wrap it in acid-free tissue and place it in an archival acid-free, lignin-free box. But if your goal is to display the hat, then what you could look for is some type of three-dimensional display case that either comes with UV filtered glass or allows you to add a film of UV filtering to it. And if you do display it, you would want to do it in a way that the interior of the hat is supported. So you can stuff the open part of the hat where the head goes with archival tissue to make sure it's not slumping or being crushed. And then you can display it in your case or even on top of you've probably seen mannequin heads and those kinds of supports in stores where they sell hats. If you have something like that that the hat can sit on, it will allow it to keep smooth across the top of the hat so that it's not folding in on itself. So that's what I would recommend. I hope that answers your question. Oh, here's another question. I have my grandma's handwritten recipe book that's tightly bound and fading. Any suggestions to preserve it? Might be difficult to scan. I want to share recipes with the family. Okay, so in this instance, since there's a real interest in sharing recipes with the family, scanning might be a good option, but you don't want to do that until the item is stabilized. So if it is falling apart or showing any damage, if you're able to afford it, I would have a conservator restore it and ask the conservator to do it in a way that keeps as much of the original as possible. So you just want stabilization. You don't want rebinding. You don't want completely remaking of the recipe book, but rather you want a conservator to mend torn pages or identify anything that has active mold or something like that. So since it's already fading, I would suggest stabilizing it to the extent you can, which would be, asking a conservator to work on it. If that's not possible, I would have overhead photography scanning of that book because it sounds like it's tightly bound, so you wouldn't want to put it on a flatbed scanner, but you could place it in a support or cradle and then carefully photograph or pay someone to photograph each page so that you create digital scans that way without any sort of equipment coming into contact with your book and causing more harm. Once those scans have been made, you might want to just retire the original, wrap it in archival tissue and place it in a box, and then use the scans or the photocopies to share with your family and for your day-to-day use. Okay, it looks like we have time for perhaps one more question. Let's see. I have a linen tablecloth that a great-grandma wove after growing the flat. Wow! It's been it's been told to never bleach and keep it in air and not plastic. Okay, so a linen tablecloth. Actually, I'm saying archival tissue a lot, but I think wrapping something into acid-free archival tissue is a great way to protect it, especially if it's fabric-based. One thing that you can do with tablecloths is, if possible, if since it's going to be large and probably too large to store flat, if possible, you could roll it onto an archival acid-free tube, and then after you've gently rolled it onto that tube, wrap it in archival tissue and store it that way. You want to really keep it away from light. That's going to be a major enemy to anything that's fabric-based because the colors in fabrics will fade, and they also are susceptible to mold growth if they're not in the right condition. So having good airflow and air movement where you store that kind of tablecloth would be important so that you didn't have stagnant air leading to potential mold growth. When it says not plastic, there are good plastics. It's just you don't want to use any kind of plastic. So what I would do if it were mine is I would take it and I probably wouldn't put it on a big roll because I wouldn't have a way to store that. I would probably get a large flat archival box, and you might still have to fold it once or twice, but you could place acid-free tissue around that tablecloth and put it in the box. You don't want to press down on any of the folds because you don't want to cause any stress to the fabric. But if you store it as open and flat as possible with archival supplies out of the light, it should last a long time, or as long as it is able to last. Well, it looks like we are nearing the end of our time. There may be time for one last question. We've got 2 minutes here. If anyone would like to ask something, please feel free. I see a hand up. Yes, let's see. Please
Okay.
go ahead.
I take it this is being filmed.
It is.
Where can we find it?
Excellent question. Yes, the university IT department is filming this, the video department, and as soon as they give the film copy back to us, we will be able to provide access to it through the library's social media accounts. So just keep an eye. If you follow the libraries on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, we can share the links there. Um, and that's probably a good way to get it. But if you don't, feel free to email me, and I will make sure that you receive a copy or at least access to the link. My email address is Morris MORRIS 18. So the number's 18. That's Morris 18 at purdue.edu. So feel free to send additional questions my way, and if I can't answer them, I would be happy to find someone who can or share additional resources with you.
Sammy?
Yes.
Hi, Sammy. This is Donna.
Hi.
Hi. Just to tell folks that this video recording will be posted on the library's YouTube channel, and so hopefully we'll have your email address and we can send you that link once it's posted as well. But you can also look, as Sammy said, in our social media sites like Instagram and all of that, and that will be linked there to the recording as well. Okay, thanks. Sorry, Sammy.
No, that's great. Thank you, Donna. That answered my question. And it looks like we are at the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and thank you all for your time today. Encourage you to watch the video and email me with any questions. And I'd love to hear more about your collections. Thank you so much for joining me today.